I've lived in Terrebonne Parish my entire life, and I know the difference between silence and quiet. Silence is just the absence of noise. Quiet is when something deliberately stops making it. That's what settled over the bayou in early June of 2019. The frogs didn't call at dusk. The insects didn't rise in clouds when the sun went down. Even the water lost its usual restless slap against the banks. It lay flat and dark, like a sheet pulled tight over a body. The heat came early that year. Not the honest kind that rolls in with cicadas and afternoon storms, but a heavy, pressing warmth that lingered long after midnight. The air felt used, breathed too many times already. Men complained they couldn't sleep. Dogs refused to go near the water. I started waking before dawn, with the taste of metal in my mouth and the feeling that I'd forgotten something important. My family has worn a badge here since Reconstruction. We've buried secrets the way the swamp buries bones. Slowly, completely, and without apology. I was raised to respect the bayou, not because it's dangerous, but because it remembers. That summer, standing on my porch before sunrise, watching mist cling to the cypress knees, I understood something had shifted. The land wasn't restless. It was patient. And patience, in a place like this, has always meant hunger. Tyler Guidry vanished on a Tuesday, which bothered me more than it should have. People expect bad things to happen on weekends, at night, during storms. Tyler disappeared on a clear afternoon, heat shimmering off the road, the bayou calm and ordinary. 19 years old, skinny, polite, the kind of kid who said yes sir without irony. He'd driven out to drop crawfish traps near a bend of water locals avoid without ever agreeing why. His truck was still there when we found it, keys on the dash, phone gone. No sign of a struggle, no broken reeds, no disturbed mud. The water was so still it reflected the sky perfectly, like it was trying to pretend nothing had passed through it. We dragged the area anyway. Boats, hooks, floodlights after dark. The bayou gave us nothing back. His grandmother sat on her porch every night, waiting. She told me Tyler hated swimming, hated even the idea of deep water. Said he'd once woken up screaming after dreaming he was sinking and couldn't remember how to breathe. That detail stuck with me. People don't usually vanish into the very thing they fear most. By the third day, the search crews were tired and quiet. I stood at the water's edge just after sunset, listening. For a moment, I thought I heard something drifting up from beneath the surface. Not a voice, not exactly, more like the echo of one. Then the water moved, just slightly, and whatever it was, slipped away. Tyler's phone showed up on his grandmother's porch 3 days later, resting beside her rocking chair like someone had set it there gently. No mud, no scratches. The screen was dark but warm to the touch, as if it had just been taken from a pocket. She called me before she picked it up, said she didn't want to touch something that had crossed water without getting wet. The timestamp on the first recording made my stomach tighten. It was created more than a day after Tyler disappeared. I listened to it alone in my office, door closed, lights off. His voice came through thin and distant, like it was being filtered through layers of liquid. He sounded calm, too calm. He said my name, then paused, as if listening to something just out of reach. He talked about the water like it was air, about how breathing didn't hurt anymore, about hearing singing that wasn't sound so much as direction. Halfway through the recording, there was a low vibration beneath his words, a hum that made the desk tremble under my hands. When the file ended, another appeared instantly. I hadn't touched anything. The phone sat there, screen glowing faintly, waiting. Outside my office window, the bayou was perfectly still. I realized then that whatever had taken Tyler hadn't lost him. It had learned how to send him back, piece by piece, through his voice. I played Tyler's recording again the next morning, this time with the sun up and the office door open. As if light and witnesses might make a difference, it didn't. His voice still carried that hollow, waterlogged quality, each word stretching a fraction longer than it should. When he spoke, there were brief pauses where I could hear something else, faint movement, like a current shifting against stone. He said he could breathe without thinking about it, said his chest didn't burn, didn't panic, didn't remember the rules it had followed his entire life. He laughed once, quietly, and the sound raised the hair on my arms. It wasn't fear or joy. It was relief. The kind people feel when they stop fighting something they've been resisting for too long. As the recording continued, he mentioned seeing lights below the surface, arranged like streets. He described voices speaking all at once, not loudly, but with perfect clarity, as if they were inside his head instead of around him. Near the end, he lowered his voice and said there was a woman singing somewhere ahead of him. He couldn't see her, but he knew where to go. When the audio cut out, the room felt heavier. The computer clock had stopped for several seconds before jumping forward again. I sat there listening to the silence, realizing the recording hadn't been a message. It was an invitation. By the end of that week, Tyler's phone was sealed in an evidence bag and locked in the steel cabinet behind my desk. No charger, no signal. Battery already flagged as critically low. I logged it like any other item and told myself the worst was over. That grief was just finding creative ways to speak. Then, at 2:14 a.m., my office computer chimed. A new audio file had appeared. The cabinet was still locked. The evidence seal was intact. Tyler's phone hadn't moved, yet the file sat there with a fresh timestamp, its length counting upward in real time. I listened as it finished recording. His breathing came through steady and slow, layered with a soft rushing sound, like water moving through a tunnel. He talked about distance losing meaning, about how far and deep were the same thing now. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Sometimes the files appeared while the phone was powered down. Once, the battery indicator actually rose instead of falling. I brought in technicians, state boys, even a private contractor who specialized in digital forensics. None of them could explain how a device with no power source was generating new data. At night, alone in the office, I started to hear faint audio bleed from the cabinet itself. Not words, just vibration. Like something practicing how to speak through plastic and steel, getting closer to figuring it out. I stopped thinking of the recordings as random when I noticed the gaps between them. They didn't appear at regular intervals, but they weren't chaotic either. When I lined up the timestamps on my screen, a rhythm emerged, subtle but deliberate. The files clustered during the hottest hours of the night, when the air was thick and the Bayou water felt almost warm to the touch. When a storm rolled in and cooled the surface, the recording stopped. I started keeping notes. Temperature, tide charts, moon phases. The pattern sharpened with every entry. New audio surfaced when the water was high and the heat refused to break, as if the bayou itself needed certain conditions to speak clearly. On cooler nights, the phones stayed silent, their screens dark and ordinary. The static beneath Tyler's voice changed too. At first it was just noise, but slowed down, filtered. It carried structure. The hum rose and fell like breathing. Once, isolating a narrow frequency band, I caught something that sounded like harmony, multiple tones moving together, not interfering, not competing. That was when I understood this wasn't communication in the human sense. It was resonance. The recordings weren't messages sent from below, they were echoes, produced when the world above and the world beneath briefly vibrated at the same frequency. And each time it happened, that overlap felt a little wider. The second disappearance didn't make the news, neither did the third. In Terrebonne Parish, people go missing often enough that the first instinct is to wait, to assume they wandered off drunk or angry or tired of being seen. But by the fifth report, even the old-timers stopped shrugging. By the 10th, nobody laughed anymore. They vanished the same way Tyler did, quietly, without damage or disorder. A fisherman who left his boat idling at the dock. A waitress who stepped outside during her smoke break and never came back. A surveyor whose GPS track ended inches from the waterline, like he'd simply stepped out of the map. Different ages, different lives. No shared habits. The Bayou didn't discriminate. It selected. Search efforts overlapped and blurred together. Names stacked up on my board faster than we could erase them. Families asked the same questions, and I gave the same answers. Each one thinner than the last. No signs of violence, no ransom, no witnesses, just water and heat and absence. What frightened me most wasn't the number, it was the calm. The swamp didn't surge or thrash or swallow. It waited. Each disappearance felt less like an accident and more like an appointment being kept. By the time the count reached 17, I stopped asking who might be next. I started wondering how many had already been called, and were simply taking their time answering. The phones began to arrive the same way the people vanished, without announcement. One appeared on a kitchen table, another on the hood of a patrol car, a third propped against a gravestone like an offering. Different brands, different carriers, all unlocked by faces that were no longer above water. Every device held recordings made after their owners disappeared. I listened to them in sequence, hours at a time, until the voices blurred together. A teenage girl describing streets glowing beneath black water. A middle-aged man laughing as he explained that depth didn't mean pressure anymore. An old woman whispering about a market where memories were weighed and traded like produce. They spoke with different accents, different rhythms, but the words bent toward the same shape. They all mentioned the singing, not music, not language, a guiding sound that didn't enter the ears so much as settle behind the eyes. They said it carried direction, purpose, reassurance. One voice would trail off, and another would pick up the description mid-thought, as if they were sharing the same sentence from different mouths. It wasn't repetition, it was harmony. Each person added a layer, a perspective, a note, alone. The recordings were disturbing. Together, they formed something cohesive and intentional. I realized then that I wasn't listening to 17 separate testimonies. I was listening to one story being told through 17 borrowed voices, all singing the same song from below the surface. I kept looking for a rule that would make it make sense. Age, health, bloodline, belief. Something I could point to and say this is why them and not us. But the more names I added to the list, the clearer it became that the Bayou wasn't following human logic. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't punishing. It was selecting the way a tide selects what it carries, without preference, without hesitation. One of the missing was a preacher who had never set foot in the water. Another was a poacher who knew every channel and shoal by heart. There were skeptics and believers, locals and newcomers, people desperate to leave, and people with nothing they wanted to escape. Whatever called them did not ask permission, and it did not explain itself. That frightened me more than intent ever could. A predator can be avoided. A motive can be interrupted. But a process doesn't care if you understand it. It only requires the right conditions. Heat, proximity, Time. Standing knee-deep in the bayou one night. I felt it then, a faint pressure, like the suggestion of a hand at my back. Not pushing, not pulling, just acknowledging that I was there, that I was close enough to be noticed. The water didn't move. It didn't need to. It had already learned something important. We weren't being taken because we were special. We were being taken because we were available. The descriptions of the place beneath the bayou grew more detailed with every recording, as if the speakers were learning how to translate something fundamentally wrong into human language. They stopped calling it underwater and started calling it inside. Streets, they said, formed naturally from flowing water, holding their shape the way stone should, bending upward and sideways without collapsing. People walked along them without sinking, without resistance, as if density itself had been renegotiated. Lights drifted through the structures like slow-moving stars, casting reflections that didn't belong to any single source. Buildings weren't built so much as agreed upon, their edges defined by currents that knew where to stop. Doors opened by parting rather than swinging, and windows looked out onto distances that felt farther than any ocean depth should allow. What unsettled me most was how casually they spoke about it. There was no wonder in their voices, no fear. They described liquid walls and suspended pathways the way someone might describe a familiar hometown street. One man compared the flow of traffic to a river delta. A woman joked that she kept getting lost because every turn felt equally close. Listening to them, I understood this wasn't a ruin or a dreamscape. It was infrastructure, a functioning place shaped over time, refined through repetition. And if streets existed, it meant something had needed them long before the first human voice ever found its way down there. The markets came up in the recordings the way bad memories do, hesitantly at first, then with unsettling clarity. They weren't places of noise or crowds, no shouting, no bargaining, just open spaces where currents slowed and people gathered as if guided by instinct. The voices struggled to explain what was being exchanged, because there were no objects in the human sense. They talked about years laid out like weight, like something you could feel pressing into your palms. Time wasn't counted forward there. It was measured by density, by how much of it you were willing to give up or take on. One man said he watched someone trade 10 years of their future for the memory of a childhood they'd never lived. Another described offering his pain, only to realize afterward that pain and time weren't as separate as he'd believed. No one forced these exchanges. That was emphasized again and again. Choice mattered, but choice was easier when consequences felt abstract, when the body didn't age the way it should, and the mind could stretch without tearing. They spoke about leaving the market lighter or heavier, without knowing which was worse. What chilled me was how normal it all sounded. Time, down there, wasn't sacred. It was a resource, renewable and shared, flowing through people the way water flows through the swamp. And listening to them, I realized we'd been treating it the same way up here, just pretending we couldn't see the current. Every recording eventually circled back to the same realization. No matter how far the speaker wandered through descriptions of streets or markets. Breathing. They talked about it with quiet disbelief, as if the body had revealed a long-kept secret. Lungs didn't burn. Chests didn't tighten. There was no panic. No reflex screaming that something was wrong. Water moved in and out as easily as air ever had. They said the fear disappeared first. The instinct that tells you you're drowning simply shut off, like a switch flipped by an unseen hand. After that, the body followed, muscles relaxed, hearts slowed. One voice admitted they kept holding their breath out of habit, only to realize they didn't need to. The water was already doing the work for them. What disturbed me wasn't the physiology, it was the acceptance. They spoke about this change the way people talk about growing used to the dark. Not as a miracle, not as a curse, but as a correction. As if humans had always been meant to do this, and had only forgotten. Listening late at night, I caught myself taking slower breaths, unconsciously matching their rhythm. That's when I stopped playing the recordings aloud. Some adaptations happen quietly, before you realize you're the one being trained. They struggled most when they tried to describe her. Places had edges, sensations had reference points. But the singing woman slipped between categories the way water slips through fingers. She wasn't a body, though she occupied space. She wasn't a ghost, though she carried voices older than memory. Every recording hesitated at this point, language stalling, as if it knew it was about to fail. They said she was made of sound the way storms are made of pressure. Not something you see, but something you feel passing through you, rearranging what's inside. When she sang, it wasn't directed outward. The sound folded inward, vibrating through bone and thought alike. One voice claimed he could feel her notes behind his eyes, tuning him like an instrument. Time bent around her, not stopped, not reversed, just layered. Past and future sat together without argument. A woman described hearing her grandmother's voice woven into the song, though the old woman was still alive above the water. Another insisted he recognized melodies that hadn't been written yet. What frightened me wasn't her power. It was her familiarity. The voices spoke of her the way children speak of a lullaby they half remember, not as something new, but as something returned. As if the singing woman wasn't invading the Bayou at all. She was waking up in a place that had always belonged to her. As the recordings continued, the purpose of the song began to surface, not through explanation, but through repetition. The singing woman wasn't calling people for companionship or sacrifice. She was collecting. Each voice described the same process from a different angle, like witnesses circling a single event. When someone spoke near her, their words didn't vanish into the water. They stayed, suspended, woven into the sound she carried. They said the Bayou forgets nothing, but it needs help remembering. Floods erase paths, generations pass, names sink. The song existed to hold what would otherwise dissolve. Every human voice added texture, context, specificity. Accents mattered. Personal histories mattered. The woman gathered them the way a recorder gathers grooves, pressing experience into something durable. One man said he could hear echoes of people from centuries ago, layered beneath the current melody. French, Choctaw, English, languages he didn't recognize at all. None of them were dominant. All of them remained. Another described feeling himself thin out as he spoke, not in pain, but in relief, like setting down a heavy pack after a long walk. The song wasn't alive in the way animals are alive. It was alive the way archives are, dependent on what's stored within them. And listening to that, I understood why silence had fallen over the bayou. It wasn't waiting to hunt. It was waiting to be filled. It took me longer than I care to admit to stop thinking of the disappearances as something to be solved. Law teaches you that every absence has a cause, every cause a culprit. But the more I listened, the clearer it became that no law had been broken. What was happening in Terrebonne Parish wasn't violence, it was recurrence. The voices never used words like murder or theft. They spoke of timing, of warmth, of thresholds thinning the way ice does before it breaks. They described the collection the way farmers describe harvests, not with cruelty, but with inevitability. Something that happens when conditions align, whether anyone is ready or not. That realization sickened me more than any monster ever could. Crimes can be punished. Cycles endure. My grandfather had written the same conclusion in his journal in 1947, his handwriting tightening as if he'd fought the truth all the way to the page. He hadn't failed to stop it. He had witnessed it. Once I accepted that, the question changed. It was no longer, who is doing this? It became, how often has this already happened? How many times had the bayou sung itself full, then gone quiet again? Standing at the water's edge, I understood something fundamental had shifted. We weren't uncovering a crime scene. We were standing inside a mechanism, and it was turning exactly as designed. I hadn't been in my grandmother's basement in years. The stairs were narrow and uneven, worn down by feet that had climbed them with purpose long before mine. She led the way without a word, stopping at a section of wall that looked no different from the rest. With a steady hand, she pressed 2 fingers against a knot in the wood. Something clicked. A thin seam opened where I hadn't known one existed. Behind it was a cabinet sunk deep into the foundation, sealed against moisture, heat, and time. Inside were objects wrapped with care that bordered on reverence. Wax cylinders, their surfaces darkened with age. A leather-bound journal swollen from decades of humidity. The smell that drifted out wasn't rot. It was preservation. My grandmother didn't touch anything. She just stood back and told me this was never meant to be found by anyone who didn't already know what they were looking for. That her father had built it after the summer of 1947, when 17 people vanished, and the swamp went quiet for years afterward. He'd left instructions, warnings, a record, not for the public, but for blood. As I lifted the journal, dust bloomed in the beam of my flashlight. I realized then this wasn't evidence hidden out of fear. It was something saved deliberately, waiting for the moment when silence returned to the bayou, and someone in our family needed to remember why. The journal was heavier than it looked, its leather cover stiff and scarred by damp hands. Eugene Thibodeau's handwriting filled every page, tight and disciplined at first, then growing uneven as the entries progressed. He wrote like a man trying to outrun a conclusion. Dates mattered to him, temperatures, water levels. He circled the same phrases again and again, as if repetition might weaken them. He described the disappearances in 1947 the same way I had in my own notes. Ordinary people, ordinary days. No signs of struggle. Then came the recordings. Not digital, of course, but wax cylinders left behind in places that made no sense. Porches, boats, church pews. Voices speaking calmly about breathing water and hearing a woman sing below the bayou. The later entries changed tone. Eugene stopped asking who and started asking when. He wrote about cycles tied to heat and thinning boundaries. About the swamp remembering itself. One passage was underlined so hard the paper tore. "This is not an invasion," he wrote. "It is maintenance." The final pages were the hardest to read. His handwriting shook. He wrote about understanding his role too late, about realizing he wasn't meant to prevent the collection. He was meant to document it, and then step aside. The journal ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing off, as if he'd been interrupted. I closed the book knowing exactly where he'd gone, and why no body had ever been found. I carried the journal upstairs and set it on the kitchen table, suddenly aware of how many meals had been eaten above that hidden cabinet. How much ordinary life had been layered over something so deliberate. My grandmother watched me the way people watch someone reach the end of a story they already know. She told me the truth plainly, without drama. No Thibodeau had ever chosen this role. It was inherited the same way the land was, in silence. Every generation. When the waters warmed and the bayou grew still. One of us stood close enough to listen, Some tried to fight it. Some tried to warn outsiders. None of that changed the pattern. What mattered was memory. The family stayed because someone had to remember what the song was for, and what happened when it was ignored. She told me Eugene had walked into the swamp willingly, not as a sacrifice, but as a conclusion. He had finished his part. Others before him had done the same. Others had stayed behind, guarding records, guiding those who returned, making sure the crossings didn't turn into chaos. Sheriff wasn't the title that mattered. Witness was. Sitting there, I felt the weight of it settle into place. My badge, my job, my years of service, they weren't coincidences. They were alignment. The Bayou hadn't chosen me because I was special. It had chosen me because I was already standing where my family always had. Close enough to hear, and close enough to stay. They came back at dawn, one by one, stepping out of the bayou as if emerging from a long, private conversation. No alarms, no rushing water, just figures breaking the surface mist and placing bare feet on the mud with careful balance. By the time the sun cleared the trees, all 17 stood at the edge of the clearing, breathing evenly, eyes adjusting to light they hadn't seen in weeks. There were no wounds, no signs of hunger or dehydration. Clothes were intact, hair clean, skin unbroken. Medical checks later would confirm what was already obvious. Their bodies had been corrected. Old scars were gone. A man who'd limped for years walked straight. A woman with failing lungs inhaled deeply, without effort. Time, at least the kind that damages, had been selectively undone. They didn't speak at first. When they did, it was softly, almost rehearsed, not fearful, not confused, just precise. They answered questions before they were asked, knew names of deputies they'd never met, referred to events that hadn't happened yet with casual certainty. What unsettled me most was the stillness in them. They weren't relieved to be back. They weren't grateful. It felt less like a rescue and more like a return from a place they still belonged to. As the sun climbed higher, light caught their eyes and flashed back sharp and pale, like reflections off wet stone. I realized then the bayou hadn't given them back. It had finished with them. For now, the change was easiest to see in their eyes. In shade, they looked almost normal, pupils steady, expressions calm. But when light hit them directly, something answered back. A sharp, pale reflection flared and vanished, the same way it does in alligators when a spotlight catches them at night. No human eye should do that. Every time it happened, a quiet unease rippled through whoever was watching. Doctors ran tests and found nothing wrong. Retina's healthy, no sign of trauma. Reflexes improved. If anything, the returned could track movement with unsettling accuracy, turning their heads before a sound fully registered. More than once. One of them looked toward the bayou seconds before something disturbed the water's surface, as if responding to a signal we couldn't hear. They spoke normally when addressed, but never over one another. Conversations flowed with unnatural efficiency. No pauses, no misunderstandings. When one of them searched for a word, another supplied it without prompting, finishing the sentence in the same flat tone. It felt less like cooperation and more like a shared operating system. At night, deputies reported seeing them stand near windows or open doors, motionless, eyes fixed on the dark water beyond the trees. Not restless, not longing, just attentive, watching something that watched back. I began to understand that whatever they had gained beneath the surface hadn't replaced them. It had been added, and it was still looking through their eyes. It became clear they weren't just sharing information, they were sharing time. When questioned separately, their answers aligned too closely to be coincidence. One would begin describing an event from the 1800s. Floods, riverboats, gunshots echoing through trees, and another would continue the account seamlessly, shifting perspective without breaking rhythm. Neither claimed it as memory. They spoke of it the way people speak of weather, something that had happened around them. More troubling were the things they spoke about that hadn't happened yet. A woman calmly mentioned a bridge collapse 2 counties over, giving a date that hadn't arrived. A man corrected her on the hour it would occur, when it did, weeks later. The details matched with sickening precision. There was no excitement in their voices when they were proven right, no sense of prophecy fulfilled, just confirmation. They explained it as overlap. Time. Below the bayou, didn't line up in a single direction. Moments stacked, bled, pressed together until past and future were simply adjacent spaces. Being there had stretched them across that compression, and they'd brought some of it back. Listening to them speak together was like hearing a choir hold a single note forever. No rise, no fall, just sustained presence. I realized then that individuality hadn't been erased. It had been synchronized. Each of them was still themselves, just tuned to something much larger, something that continued to sing through them long after they'd left the water. They began to drift toward the cypress grove on the second night after their return. Not all at once, but with quiet certainty. No messages were exchanged, no plans announced. Each of them simply rose from wherever they were staying and walked, drawn along back roads and game trails as if following a map only they could see. By sunset, I knew where they were going before anyone said a word. The grove sat on a patch of high ground locals avoided, a ring of ancient trees whose roots nodded above the water like exposed bones. I arrived just after dark. The air there felt different, heavier, charged, the way it does before a storm that never quite breaks. Insects vanished as I stepped into the clearing. Even the wind seemed to lose interest. The 17 stood among the cypress trunks in a loose circle, faces lifted, eyes catching stray moonlight. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The water around the grove began to rise without spilling, climbing roots and trunks in smooth, deliberate lines. It didn't flood. It assembled, watching it. I felt the same pressure I'd felt weeks earlier in the bayou, a recognition. This wasn't a gathering of people. It was a convergence. Something ancient was being given the space it required. And the grove, older than memory, was answering by opening itself. The water didn't behave like water anymore. It rose in clean angles and slow curves, folding back on itself without spilling a drop. Columns formed where roots met air, translucent and steady, holding their shape as if reinforced by invisible walls. Pathways arched upward, connecting pools to one another, creating corridors that hovered just above the mud. Gravity seemed to hesitate, unsure which rules still applied. Light moved through the structures, bending and splitting, casting reflections that didn't match the moon or stars. I could see depth where there shouldn't have been any, openings that suggested distance far greater than the clearing allowed. When one of the returned stepped forward, the surface parted for them without resistance, sealing again behind their foot like a closing eyelid. The air vibrated faintly, the same hum I'd heard beneath the recordings, now strong enough to feel in my teeth. The architecture wasn't built for us. Its proportions were wrong. Its entrances angled away from human comfort. Yet it fit the grove perfectly, aligning with roots and water lines that had been waiting centuries for this exact configuration. I realized then this wasn't a breach or an eruption. It was an assembly. The bayou wasn't tearing itself open. It was arranging itself into a shape it remembered, revealing corridors that had always existed, hidden by the simple act of being flat and ordinary until the night demanded more. They came from the edges of the clearing first, not the 17, but others, drawn by the soundless hum and the impossible sight of water standing still. A terminally ill woman leaning on her sister's arm. A man whose hands shook too badly to hold his cigarettes anymore. People who had already made their peace with endings. No one stopped them. No one guided them. They approached the liquid structures the way you approach a door you've been staring at your whole life. Some hesitated at the threshold. The water responded by lowering, reshaping itself to meet them halfway. When they stepped forward, there was no splash, no gasp. The surface opened and accepted them gently, closing again without a trace. Their faces held something close to relief. My deputy stood beside me, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the nearest archway. He'd buried a son the year before. When he stepped away, he didn't ask permission. He just nodded once, like a man clocking out after a long shift. I called his name. He didn't turn around. In total, 30 people walked into the water that night. Not taken, not chased, chosen. When the last of them disappeared, the architecture began to dissolve, edges softening, pathways sinking back into the bayou. The grove fell quiet again. What remained wasn't loss. It was vacancy, and the knowledge that the door would open again, whenever enough people were ready to notice it. I stood alone in the clearing long after the water settled back into itself, the grove returning to its familiar shape as if nothing had happened. The mud was undisturbed. The roots lay bare and ordinary again. Anyone arriving at dawn would have seen nothing but trees and dark water. But I felt the absence the way you feel, a pulled tooth with your tongue, an empty space that refuses to be ignored. That was when understanding finally settled in. Heavy and unmistakable. I hadn't been there to stop anything. I hadn't been there to save anyone. Every moment I'd spent fighting, cataloging, questioning. It had all been preparation, not resistance. The bayou hadn't needed a sheriff that night. It had needed a witness. My grandfather's words from the journal surfaced with new clarity. Bridge, threshold, terms I'd dismissed as metaphor. Standing there, I realized they were instructions. Someone had to remain on this side, fluent in rules that no longer applied, but still mattered. Someone had to remember names, faces, dates. Someone had to explain to the returned how to stand upright in a world that suddenly felt thinner. The role wasn't chosen. It was recognized, passed forward quietly. The way currents pass heat, I felt it lock into place, not like a burden, but like alignment. The bayou hadn't called me to cross. It had called me to stay. Not everyone who stepped into the water stayed there. I learned that in the days that followed. When figures began to emerge from the bayou alone, without ceremony or sound. They came back at odd hours, just before dawn, in the dead space after midnight, walking out of the trees with damp clothes and steady breathing. No escorts, no confusion, just quiet certainty. These were not the same as the 17. Their eyes reflected light normally. Their voices didn't carry that flattened harmony. But something in them had shifted all the same. They moved carefully, as if the ground were less reliable than they remembered. Several asked the same question in different words. How long was I gone? When I answered. They accepted it without argument, though their expressions suggested the number didn't match what they felt. They described crossing only briefly. A threshold, a pressure, a choice made and unmade in the same moment. Some said they'd gone too far and been gently turned back. Others said they'd seen enough to know they still belonged above water. None spoke of fear, only clarity. My job became simple and endless. I listened. I wrote. I reminded them how to sleep, how to eat, how to let time move in one direction again. They needed anchoring, not interrogation. Watching them relearn the weight of their own bodies. I understood the crossing wasn't irreversible, but it wasn't harmless either. Something always comes back with you, even when you don't notice it at first. The weight of it didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated. Every root returned soul. Every name recorded. Every night I spent listening to the water instead of sleeping added another layer. I stopped thinking in days and started thinking in seasons, in temperatures, in how close the bayou felt to speaking again. Being the guardian wasn't about authority. I couldn't close the door, and I couldn't force it open. My burden was narrower and heavier than that. I had to stay alert enough to recognize when the boundary thinned, steady enough to stand where others couldn't, and human enough to translate what happened without turning it into myth or madness. I had to keep records knowing they would outlive me, waiting for hands that hadn't been born yet. Some nights I felt the pull myself, a gentle suggestion, never a demand. The water didn't rush me. It didn't need to. It knew patience better than I ever would. I understood then why my grandfather had written until his hands shook, why he'd chosen ink and wax over confession. This role doesn't end with death. It ends with forgetting. So I stayed. I cataloged. I listened when no one else would. Because someone has to stand at the edge and say, this happened, even when the world isn't ready to hear it. The burden isn't guarding the threshold. It's remaining human while doing it, and knowing, every night, that the water remembers you standing there. I built the archive quietly, without announcements or funding proposals that asked too many questions. A reinforced room beneath the parish office, sealed against humidity and heat, lined with shelving rated to survive floods that hadn't happened yet. Climate control ran on redundancies. Power backups stacked like insurance policies against the future the bayou was going to remember. So was I. Every recording had a place. Digital files mirrored onto physical media. Wax cylinders cleaned, stabilized, cataloged by date, temperature, water level. Journals scanned and preserved, then wrapped and stored again. I kept copies in different locations, not out of paranoia, but respect. Memory fails when it's kept in one container. I didn't edit anything. No summaries, no conclusions. The archive wasn't meant to explain. It was meant to exist. To say this was heard, and this was said. Some nights I sat alone among the shelves, listening to voices layered across decades, feeling the hum of overlap even through the insulation. People think archives are about the past. They're wrong. They're about continuity, about making sure something survives long enough to be recognized again. As I locked the final cabinet and logged the last entry, I understood the room wasn't finished. It never would be. The archive wasn't a monument. It was a holding breath, waiting for the next time the water decided to sing. My daughter was born during a storm that rolled in without warning, thunder stacking on the horizon like something being assembled. The rain started the moment she cried, hard and sudden, drumming against the hospital roof with a rhythm that felt deliberate. Nurses joked about timing. I didn't. We named her Melody because the word had already been living in my head for months. It felt less like a choice and more like recognition. From the beginning. She calmed when it rained. Her breathing slowed with the rhythm of water on glass. When storms passed and the air went dry. She grew restless, small fingers flexing as if searching for something she couldn't see. As she grew, the signs sharpened. She learned to walk early, always toward puddles, toward rivers, toward the sound of moving water. Once, during a heavy downpour, she laughed and pointed at the sky, babbling in a cadence that made my chest tighten. For a moment, it sounded like harmony. Doctors found nothing unusual. Development was normal. Perfect. Even. But I watched her the way my grandmother had watched me, with knowledge she never fully explained. Some legacies don't announce themselves as curses. They arrive quietly, wrapped in comfort and familiarity. Holding my daughter near the window during a late-night storm, I understood the truth I'd been avoiding. The role doesn't end. It echoes, and one day, she will hear the water not as noise, but as language. The world has started to feel warmer in ways the forecasts don't explain. Summers stretch longer, rains come heavier, then vanish for weeks. I watch the bayou rise and fall and recognize the pattern repeating itself on a larger scale. What happened here wasn't isolated. It was rehearsal. Scientists talk about adaptation like it's a choice, something we'll decide on when the time comes. But adaptation doesn't wait for permission. It prepares quietly, using places like Terrebonne Parish as testing grounds. The singing woman wasn't collecting victims. She was preserving instructions. I think about the people who walked into the water and didn't come back, about those who returned, altered just enough to notice what others still ignore. About my daughter, breathing steadily as rain taps against the roof, already more comfortable with water than air. The future won't arrive all at once. It will seep in. One day, breathing the old way will feel wrong. Panic will set in where comfort used to live. And when that happens, people will look for places that remember another method, places where the boundary is thin and the song is already waiting. When that day comes, I'll still be here, listening, recording, standing at the edge as long as I'm able. Because survival isn't about fighting change. It's about remembering how to let it in. And when the water rises high enough, we won't be drowning. We'll be remembering.